Okay, I am very happy to introduce today our Jordan Center Fellow, Kirill Zubkov, who is Associate Professor of Higher School of Economics and Research Fellow at the Institute of Russian Literature in St. Petersburg. Kirill Zubkov's work primarily concentrates on mid-19th century Russian fiction and drama, featuring such authors as Pisimsky, Goncharov, Ostrovsky, with a special emphasis on literary institutions such as censorship. He has done some fascinating work on the literary prizes, the Uvarov Prize, and in general, just as my personal opinion, I'm always extremely excited to see that something by Kirill Zubkov has come out, because all sorts of pearls will appear. For example, I will find out that Pisimsky had penned a pornographic novel when he was a young man, and Kirill's incredibly intelligent discussion of it, philologically rich discussion of that novel was one of the joys.
I said I couldn't quote a single line from it because it's
right.
I couldn't.
but you quoted little phrases that testified to the fact that Pisimsky indeed is the author. Anyway, this is only the so we know what to expect now from Kirill. So please welcome Kirill. Will tell us about writers and censors in the Russian Empire, the case of Ivan Goncharov.
Thank you again. I'm very glad to speak here at Jordan Center, and I'm very glad to see everybody here. So let me begin. First of all, I will start with Ivan Goncharov. Here you can see one of his portraits, which is where here he is represented in as some kind of bourgeois of mid-19th century, and this is actually characteristic of Goncharov. It's really typical for him. Of course, I think most of people present here know Goncharov as the author of one of the most famous Russian novels of mid-19th century, the author of Oblomov. But today I am not going to discuss Oblomov, and I am actually not going to discuss, at least not in details, any famous novels by Goncharov, and I'm also not going to discuss his famous travelogue. So I'm going to discuss a different side of his literary and not so literary career. What draws my attention today is his censorship career. Goncharov was a high-ranked censor in the Russian Empire, and that's something that should puzzle most modern readers, because for us, as for several Goncharov's contemporaries, it's really strange to imagine a writer who is also a censor. I mean, we usually consider writers and censors as enemies who must be opposed to each other, and of course, writer and censor in our opinion. Generally, should not coincide. A person cannot be a writer and censor simultaneously. This is actually the main problem of my talk. How could we understand it? What should we do with that strange combination of being an author and a censor at the same time? To analyze it, I will depart from modern scholarship of literary censorship. For example, Robert Dunton's book *Censors at Work*, which basically states that that censorship was not only an instrument of political control and repression. Of course, it was an instrument of political control and repression, but not only that. The censorship was also literary activity. Actually, it is not possible to be a censor of literary works and not to engage in interpretation, in critical analysis, and so on and so on, because otherwise you will not be able to understand the literary works. So, in reality, literature and censorship were not opposed to each other. They were intertwined, and they in a very complex manner. And usually it's not possible to draw a clear line between literature and censorship. So, I will try to demonstrate this complicated entanglement of literature and censorship in mid-19th century. And Ivan Goncharov is going to become a sort of a peculiar case which demonstrates how this complicated interaction of literature and censorship could take place. At the end of 1855, when Goncharov agreed to become a member of the St. Petersburg Censorship Committee, his decision aroused a burst of discontent among many of his contemporaries. By all accounts, it was due to the belief that it was impossible to combine the social roles of writer and censor. Goncharov himself did not share this perception of his social position, although he did understand the reasoning behind it. Reacting to the harsh criticism directed at him on the pages of Herzen's The Bell, Kolokol, the famous emigre journal, Goncharov wrote to Andrei Krajewsky. Andrei Krajewsky was an editor of Отечественной записки, a literary magazine where Oblomov appeared. So Goncharov wrote to Krajewsky. Although in the London edition, as I have heard, they're smearing me, and not just me, but seemingly all Russian writers. It doesn't bother me, because I know that if I'd written God knows what, even then they'd show me no mercy on account of my title and occupation alone. By occupation he means that he was censored. Judging from this letter, Goncharov did not see a contradiction between his title and occupation and his role as a Russian writer. However, by the mid-1870s, the writer's attitude towards his own office changed a lot. In his autobiography called Uncommon Story, необыкновенная история, written at that time, he made it clear that combining the duties of censor with his literary activities required a huge effort. Writing was my passion, but I worked of necessity, and later as a censor, no less. God forgive me. I traveled around the world, and besides, and I had to worry about earning wages. So that was. So it was impossible to, or at least very difficult to be censor and writer at the same time. So between 1850s and 1870s, Goncharov reversed his opinion on the possibilities of combining the roles of censor and writer. To some extent, it is possible to attribute this reversal to Goncharov's personal circumstances. In 1850s, he was confident of his significance to the field of literature, but after publication of his poorly reviewed novel *The Precipice* in late 60s, Goncharov wasn't quite so sure. So he refused to compose new larger works, and he suspected Turgenev of intentionally disrupting his literary career by plagiarizing his works and selling them to all his contemporaries in all the countries. It was a sort of paranoia, because Goncharov literally believed that Gustave Flaubert stole his works. Questioning his own literary authority, Goncharov probably felt the need to justify his job, perceived by his contemporaries as dubious, to say the least. However, it appears that Goncharov's change of heart was due not only to psychological reasons and not even to the change in Goncharov's literary status. To some extent, it was influenced by Goncharov's service in the censorship. So I will try to demonstrate what actually happened to Goncharov during his censorship career and why he changed his mind so much during this career. I will actually there were two periods of Goncharov's career as a censor. During the first period, which started from 1856 and lasted for 4 years, Goncharov was a rank-and-file member of the St. Petersburg Censorship Committee, which, like most Imperial Russian censorship organizations, was part of the Ministry of Public Education, Министерство народного просвещения. It's difficult to translate this name correctly. The second period, which also lasted for 4 years and which was in the mid-60s, concerns his service in the new reformed censorship department, now part of the Ministry of the Interior. At that time, Goncharov was a member of the Council of the Minister of the Interior on matters of book printing, which was actually the highest censorship authority in 19th century Russia, with the exception of Minister of the Interior himself and the Emperor. So Goncharov was very high-ranked censor at that time, and he was a person who would make important and fundamental decisions on censorship politics at that time. The nature of Goncharov's service, however, corresponded not only with the change of his status in the bureaucratic system. The government's notion of the functions and place of censorship in the relationships between the state and society had markedly changed. It's important to note that the censor was no longer perceived as part of the educational establishment of Ministry of Education. Rather, he became a functionary of the ministry responsible for the police. So the censor became something closer to a policeman than to an educator. Under Nicholas I, whose reign is usually perceived as a period of especially tightening censorship, the censor's function had more to do with educating writers, whom the state perceived as not fully competent. Significantly, the rank-and-file censors very rarely took part in such well-known repressive actions of government as, say, declaring Petr Chadaev insane. All those really repressive actions were taken personally by the emperor, or by much more high-ranked officials than ordinary censors. Moreover, many censors engaged in personal relationships with the writers and aspired to help them. Thus, the publisher of the journal Moskvityanin, Mikhail Pogudin, was in friendly correspondence with his censor, while Alexander Nikitenko, also a censor, became co-editor of Nekrasov's the Contemporary in order to use his own experience as a censor to help the publisher, to help the publisher in its work. Thus, the publisher of the journal Moskvityanin, Mikhail Pogudin, was in friendly correspondence with his censor, while Alexander Nikitenko, also a censor, became co-editor of Nekrasov's the Contemporary in order to use his own experience as a censor to help the publisher in his duties. Officially, of course, the journal was not censored by Nikitenko himself, but Nikitenko knew how his colleague could work and how he could perceive different materials in the journal. So, until so in the first half of 19th century, literary work was not considered an autonomous occupation, distinguished from public service. Therefore, combining the roles of censor and writer elicited neither surprise nor disapproval. This, of course, does not mean that all writers who occupied posts in censorship held the same views of precisely how to reconcile these roles. For example, it never occurred to Sergei Aksakov contemporaries to criticize him for fulfilling his censorial obligations in the late 20s. But by the mid-50s, however, this attitude towards literature was a thing of the distant past. Russian writers now considered it a disgrace to work as a censor. The new attitude was most candidly articulated in the diary entries. For example, the one by Alexander Druzhinin, a writer, critic, and translator. It's exactly about Goncharov's new appointment. I've heard of the great reforms regarding censorship, and that Goncharov is becoming a censor. It's a mistake for one of the foremost Russian writers to accept a position of this sort. I don't consider it disgraceful, but first of all, it takes up the writer's time. Second, the public opinion disapproves of it, and third, a writer shouldn't be a censor. This reaction was largely inspired, on the one hand, by the advent of the thick journals on literary criticism in 30s and 40s. The growing increasing role of literary journals meant that writers' occupation became more and more autonomous and more independent from political efforts of government, and writers became more and more oriented towards society, towards the public sphere, as we could probably say. Well, I'm not sure that there was actually so well-developed public sphere in 19th century Russia, but I think at least writers and editors of Russian literary journals believed that there was a sort of society to which they could refer. Another problem was extremely harsh censorship, which was created by the government after the European revolutions of late 40s. In this period of the history of censorship in Russia is called 7 dark years, Мрачные 70. During that period, the government strove to annihilate the freedom of the printed word as effectively as possible. The newly established secret committee of April the 2nd of 1848 demanded the censorship's intervention in the most diverse publication. This committee was completely secret, and actually it had no official functions. Actually, formally it could do nothing. But the only thing that the committee could do was to appeal to the emperor. And the emperor usually listened to the committee, and that was the ultimate power in 19th century Russia, actually. So the committee could voice their concerns over aesthetic matters. For example, extremely harsh satirical position of Alexander Ostrovsky towards the Moscow merchants. And for problems of more formal and bureaucratic kinds. For example, they were shocked to discover that there were no notations authorizing candy wrappers. So candy wrappers without permission by censor, it's terrible disruptive fact. And and they reported to the emperor about that. The committee also monitored the censors themselves, reporting to the emperor on any ill-intentioned works that they governed. Following the death of Nicholas I, however, the government embarked on a course towards liberalizing censorship for a while and towards collaborating with the public. The secret committee was dissolved, and actually the person who came with this idea was the head of the committee, who considered this organization completely useless at the time. The point was not only to moderate the censorship in literature, but also to establish press and public opinion that could promote the interests of the government and that could help the government with the beginning reforms. Actually, late 50s and 60s were probably the only period in the Russian history where government consistently attempted to consult the public opinion on the matter of governmental decisions. It was really very typical position. So the censorship was supposed to embody the positive influence, as they called it. So to not only to restrict printed matter, but to guide it towards the government's goals. In the mid-50s, a group of so-called liberal bureaucrats, headed by Grand Prince Konstantin Nikolaevich, sought to bridge the gap between the Russian government and literature. From their perspective, the writer could both remain a part of the literary community and serve the state at the same time. In other words, literature was perceived as an instrument of public opinion, independent of the state, which should not be suppressed but effectively used in governing the empire. Konstantin Nikolaevich, for example, initiated a so-called literary expedition along the banks of the Volga River. The travelogues of Goncharov, who traveled on the frigate Pallada before the decision, served as a model both for the officials who financed the expedition and the writers who had to compose the literary descriptions of Russia's most important river. Apparently, this factor determined Goncharov's reputation in official circles, which at the beginning of Alexander II's reign endeavored to transform the Department of Censorship. Goncharov later recalled that his appointment to the post of censor was linked to the overall liberalization. As he expressed it, they talked a lot, argued about literature, dined noisily, happily. In a word, it was good. Then even censorship eased up. In 1856, I was offered the position of censor, and I had to accept it. So we can clearly see that that the liberalization and his appointment were connected in his opinion. Many contemporaries regarded Goncharov as precisely the kind of person who, regardless of his many years of civil service, and Goncharov was had been official for quite a long time before his appointment as censor, still had succeeded in remaining a man of letters and not only a bureaucrat. This determined his appointment as a censor too. As you know, Goncharov took his post in the censorship department thanks to the influence of Alexander Nikitenko, high-ranked censor and member of Academy of Sciences. Nikitenko wrote in his diary, I finally managed to get Goncharov in as a censor. On the 1st of January, there are relieving 3 censors, the most ridiculous. So yeah, the government didn't like the censors of from the old times, from the times of Nicholas I. Goncharov will replace one of them in the hope, of course, that he'll be different. He's intelligent, very discreet, and will be a fair and good censor. By the same token, it will rescue him from the official job. So I think it's very important that becoming a censor could, in Nikitenko's opinion, rescue Goncharov from officialdom, from bureaucracy. So actually, serving as a censor was perceived not as just a bureaucratic official work. It was perceived as something else, something closer to the work, to literary work. Goncharov, as a writer, could be saved from his official service by being a censor. And it was really very typical for the time to appoint a writer as a censor. We could also name several Goncharov's contemporaries who became high-ranking censors. For example, Fyodor Tyutchev, a well-known poet, became the head of foreign censorship at that time. Or, for example, there was novelist Ivan Goncharov, famous for his historical novels, who also became a censor. And actually, he was Goncharov's colleague. So, of course, the involvement of a respected writer in censorship could likely promote the department's reputation, and could also help the censorship to avoid exclusively conflict-ridden relations with literary circles. So Goncharov identified with the supporters of the liberal bureaucrats and perceived his service as an opportunity to fulfill the role not of a civil servant, but rather a mediator between the authorities and writer's work. Considering himself a censor of the new type, Goncharov spoke very skeptically of his colleagues, especially of his older colleagues from the past. For example, Goncharov liked telling jokes about and anecdotes about his colleagues, one of whom found, for example, free spirit in a book on cooking. His name was Yelagin. Goncharov attempted to establish a connection between writers and censorship officials. It's especially clear in his letter to Andrei Krajewski, again, one of his editors, where the censor extends the publisher an invitation to an evening hosted by Prince Shurbatov, the newly accepted chairman of the censorship committee, who so it's this is the letter by Goncharov. Prince Shurbatov asked me, it's stressed by Goncharov, asked me to ask you. It's important that Prince Shurbatov asks. He doesn't order. He asks to ask you to visit him this Friday and to visit on the following Friday evenings. He wants very much to meet editors and writers in order to establish ongoing and direct personal relations with them. By the way, as a means of clarifying literary journalistic matters. He also asked me to excuse him, please, for the fact that he, inundated in the mornings with reports and petitioners, has no opportunity to pay visits, and asks to skip these formalities. At the prince's home, you will find professors, censors, druzhin, etc. So we can, and there are also other letters by Goncharov on to other writers and editors with the same invitation. So as we can see, Shurbatov intended, and Goncharov also intended, to create a sort of public space where officials, writers, professors, and other people could meet and discuss all matters of modern literature. And of course, that's not how the censor's duties were mostly perceived in the time of Nicholas I. But when Goncharov was communicating with his colleagues, with other censors, he portrayed himself as a voice of the literary community, not of the censorship. For example, he appeals to the secretary of the censorship committee, Yaroslavtsev, almost as a medium capable of channeling the voice even of Alexander Pushkin, long dead by that time. And at the same time, this voice also seems to belong to the higher ranking official. So it seems that there was no distinction for Goncharov between Pushkin's authority and official authority. I enclose Pushkin's work and my official report, which at the last meeting I was authorized to submit. Be so kind, esteemed Andrei Konstantinovich, as to give the order as soon as possible to prepare the document for the main Directorate of Censorship, so that it arrives in time for the report at the first session after Holy Week, and so that they manage to review it in the office of the Minister of the Minister on the holiday. Yeah. Anikov begs this of you, as do I and Pushkin himself. Several members of the main directorate know about this, and by the way, Count Bludov is also interested. Count Bludov was a very high-rank official. So Pushkin, so Goncharov somehow channels Pushkin, Count Bludov, and all the writers, so that they could publish Pushkin's work as soon as possible. And actually, he succeeded. They did publish Pushkin's work. However, a job on the censorship committee did not allow the ordinary censor to demonstrate his own literary skills and talents, because its censorship practices had remained virtually unchanged since the days of Nicholas I, and those functions were not supposed to accommodate the censor's mediating function. In this sense, censorship reform hadn't even begun. In his recommendations, official rank-and-file censor was obliged to conform exclusively to censorship regulations and numerous instructions and orders by the government and the Minister of Public Education. All relatively complex cases had to be submitted to the censorship committee, which, in its turn, attempting to escape responsibility, could also leave the decision to the main directorate of censorship. With rare exceptions, when a censor had to make a relatively important decision, even disapproving of a manuscript for printing, he could not act on his own authority, but rather appeal to the opinion of his superiors. So, in all the years of his service as a censor, Goncharov independently prohibited only the works which had no relation to professional literature and which could never be considered of greater importance, such as, for example, a French work called Anagramme du nom en grec de Sa Majesté Alexandre. Or, for example, complete Russian songs edited by certain Mr. Nosovich. I don't know who that was, and I think nobody knows who that was, and so and so on and so on. While when Goncharov had to appeal to his superiors, it was in regard to such work as complete works by Yazykov, well-known Russian poet, works by Pushkin, edited by Anikov, novels by Ложечников, by the way, Goncharov's colleague in the censorship, plays of Ostrovsky, stories by Turgenev, and so on and so on. All of those are very well-known works by famous Russian writers. And when Goncharov allowed printing of Alexei Pisimsky's novel 1000 Souls without appealing to the censorship committee, he was it actually resulted badly to him, and his superiors had to criticize him in public because that was it was not allowed to publish a controversial work without approval of the superiors. An ordinary censor could not be such an important figure and could not become a mediator between censorship and literature. Moreover, writers understood it very soon. The literary community was unprepared to maintain a trusting relationship with the censors. For example, Goncharov wrote a letter to Anikov, the person who edited Pushkin's works and also a famous literary critic, actually a friend of Goncharov. This letter is, I think, very important for us. The day before yesterday, over dinner at Pisimsky's, at the very end of a dispute about Reagan, it was a censor, Goncharov's colleague, you made a general characterization of a censor. Censor is a civil servant who allows himself liberty, discretionary powers, and so on. In a word, you were unflattered. it was all set with bitterness and animosity, and was noticed most of all by me, of course, and then by others, and almost you yourself, it seemed. That is, it wasn't so much the crack itself about the censor that gave me that operation, as the fact that it was made in the presence of a censor. On another occasion, of a lunch at Nekrasov's about a month ago, you made fun of me directly, which others also noticed. So, and so on and so on. So, you can read the continuation of this rather long letter, but it seems obvious that Goncharov was insulted, and he tried to be as polite as he could, but he couldn't. So what's also important is that Goncharov avoids mentioning that Annenkov was speaking not only about censor, but about writer. Goncharov never mentions that he is not only censor but also Annenkov's colleague as a writer. I think that's also very revealing. And by the end of the first period of Goncharov's service, it seems clear that he himself wasn't sure that he could really be a writer and censor at the same time. It's for example, it's very clear if we read a letter to Alexei Pisimsky again, informing him that the shocking content of his new play, A Bitter Fate, Горькая судьбина, displeased Goncharov aesthetically. Goncharov also added, it won't be overly disgusting, it may even be favorably received in view of the latest trend in contemporary literature. As an old writer, I may be peering at it very timid, but that's my personal opinion, and I'm not defending it to that nail. However, I'm afraid of being censored for the drama unless you make concessions. But Goncharov was censored himself. It seems that he has, from the letter where Goncharov was writing as a member of the literary circles, we cannot understand that actually he was censored, and we cannot understand that actually Goncharov was one of people who was responsible for Pisimsky's drama. And more than that, Goncharov attempted to make it publishable, and he tried to argue that it be allowed. And finally, actually, Goncharov succeeded, and the Pisimsky's drama was allowed. So I think we can clearly see that Goncharov's attempts at mediating between censorship and literature ultimately failed, and he could not continue this work. Goncharov attempted to participate in upcoming reforms of censorship, and he even was one of the creators of a project of the reforms. But the reforms haven't been implemented, and when Goncharov knew about that, he immediately resigned from the censorship. But the problem was that Goncharov could not allow himself to live without his salary as a censor. And 3 years later, in 1863, he had to return to censorship. And by that time, it was already the censorship was already governed by the Minister of the Interior, and it was something very different from where Goncharov used to serve before. At the same time, Russian literature, of course, was also very different. After the dissemination of revolutionary leaflets in 1862, after the arrest of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, after obviously on fake charges, after the start of the Polish uprising, a new phase began in the relations between the state and the society. Under the circumstances, censorship was perceived as one of the government's fundamental components, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the roles of writer and and member of the Ministry of Internal of the Interior, especially of censor, were mutually exclusive. The representatives of radical democratic literary circles posed a particularly acute problem. Clashing with the governments, the radicals tended to perceive all the officials as their enemies. Moreover, they perceived even the writers who tried to somehow communicate with the government as collaborators and also as their enemies. For literary critics such as Dmitry Pisarev, it was obvious that a censorship official could not but elicit the contempt and hatred of all members of society, especially of writers. For example, Pisarev, who was writing on French literature, but obviously meant Russian literature, once stated, civil servants appointed as censors have requested that they remain anonymous to the public, but to the leadership it's hard to translate it actually. They are severely frustrated with these officials. And Benjamin Constant says that in France, at the moment, you wouldn't find a single person who would venture to go outdoors having admitted to being a censor. So Pisarev directly stated that it's dangerous to be a censor because you are hated by everybody. The very presence of the radicals in Russian literature made the conflict between the writers and the government even more harsh. As they tried to exclude every writer who wasn't directly opposed to the government from the literary process. The radicals attempted to create a line between government and writers, and ultimately it seems that they succeeded in that. And of course, the censors had to remain on the government side, not on the writers' side. Even censors themselves admitted that the conflict between the nascent public sphere in Russia and the government was inevitable, and nothing could be done about it. It's clear from, for example, a text written by censor Nikolai Medem, who was also a high-ranked censor, and which is when Medem basically supported preliminary censorship, and he stated that it was because the writers themselves considered the censors as their enemies. For example, Medem, the censor himself, wrote, "The greatest minds wearied and exasperated by the humiliating struggle with censorship over every phrase are growing cool towards science and literature, and see the authorities as their enemy." It's literally officially written by a censor, and it was submitted to the government and to discuss possible reforms of censorship. So. So the writers themselves believed that censorship was not necessary and should have been replaced by other types of control, for example, by modern courts, and it became especially clear after the reforms continues and independent courts actually appeared in Russia. But while the writers wanted to be free from censorship, the Minister of the Interior, Petr Valuev, who actually wanted something completely different. The only thing that united Valuev and the writers was that he considered it impossible for the censor to be somewhere between government and literature. Valuev was sure that censor must be representative of government, and only that. For example, when Goncharov submitted, as censor, submitted opinion that the 12th issue of the journal Russian Word, Русское Слово, represents a remarkable model of journalistic skill, remaining faithful to the adopted course. It means very bad course, without provoking administrative harassment or lesser prosecution. Valuev commented that he demanded that censors not only simply follow the protocol, but also consciously oppose literature, which he characterized as an enemy of the government. Journalistic skill can only be used against judicial and non-administrative penalties. Actually, I tried and I even consulted several colleagues how you could translate Russian bureaucratic language, but it's hard, so there are some errors. The assumption of this type of suggestion is impossible as long as a lack of skill and determination is presupposed on the side of the administration. The press council is not a trial by jury. It does not at all stand between literature and the government, but it does stand with the government. It is an arm of the government. And that's what Valuev answered to Goncharov. And of course, Goncharov had to agree and say, yes, sure, it is an arm of the government. So under Minister Valuev, high-ranking censorship personnel had not only to simply side with the government against literature, they were required to do so energetically, making use of all possible means, including those borrowed from the repository of literature itself and based on active interference in its affairs. So, and this is clearly evident in Goncharov's activity, which become notably less formalized. In his reports of that period, for instance, Goncharov directly invoked requirements of artistic criticism as arguments for his censorship decisions. But now, those arguments were needed to support the position of the government, not to express Goncharov's literary position and his literary views. So now Goncharov and other censors became not educators of writers, and they became much closer to policemen who tried to uncover some hidden crimes made by writers. So of course, in those conditions, it was not possible to maintain contact between literature and censorship. A man with tied to both literary and official circles, of course, could not be effective official or effective writer. And it's I think it's obvious that Goncharov's service in censorship actually severely harmed his literary reputation in that time. And so I think my time is obvious, so I'm not going to give you further examples, but let's just say that there are also several hilarious episodes in Goncharov's career at that time when those roles of Goncharov as censor and writer became clearly opposed to each other. For example, Goncharov was anonymously writing for Kraevsky's newspaper Golos, and he engaged in a long discussion with the radicals. Well, actually, the discussion was mostly about urbanization, as we would put it, but it's rather funny because they were mostly discussing dogs. What should we do with dogs on the streets of St. Petersburg? And the radicals, the position of radicals was basically couldn't you find some more important problem? Please, not dogs. Goncharov's position was it's actually a matter of comfort and civilization. We should improve the urban conditions in St. Petersburg, so dogs are important. Finally, it all. So, and in the end, radical critic Yuri Zhukovsky stated that Golos. So the Golos is basically spying for the government, and Golos basically writes. What Golos writes about his newspapers basically is some kind of a report to the government, and so that so the goal is basically spies, and as a, his opponent, the critic of Golos, is a spy of the government. What Zhukovsky probably didn't know that his opponent was literally governmental censor who was responsible for censoring the newspaper where Zhukovsky published his accusation. And Goncharov stopped the polemics because, well, what could he answer? Yes, I am. And soon after that, the newspaper where Zhukovsky published his works was closed not by Goncharov, but by Volodin. So we can, for this respect towards the monarch. So we can clearly see that Goncharov could not again he could not find anything common between his position as official censor of the Russian Empire and as a Russian writer. And by the late 60s, it became increasingly clear that it was completely impossible. So, and after that, it's very clear that as soon as the a possibility appeared to resign from the censorship office and to receive basically enough money to sustain himself, Goncharov did it immediately because he could not. And I think, although there is no clear statement by Goncharov, but I think that Goncharov did it completely disappointed in the possibilities of being a censor mediator, of being a liberal censor who could somehow establish communications between the government and literature. And but still it couldn't help Goncharov anymore because his reputation had already been destroyed by his service in the censorship, and radicals hated him, and his new novel published after his resignation was met with harsh criticism by the radicals. So I think generally what we see in that case is that there was a very short window of opportunities when it seemed that it was possible to establish some sort of mutually beneficial relations between the government and the society in the Russian Empire. But this window was very narrow, and it could not possibly be used both by the government and by the literary circles at that time. And Goncharov's career as censor demonstrates it very clearly.
So we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kirill. And I'm wondering, you haven't mentioned anything about what Nikitchenko and Goncharov had in common, which is, of course, they were outsiders.
You mean they were not
Nobility.
Yeah, I understand it. Yeah.
And this is a large part of what Goncharov's insecurities were vis-a-vis Turgenev in his Необыкновенная история. That he had to work, period, not necessarily as a censor, but simply that he had to work and didn't have all that time. And Turgenev was really a part of this. He was trying to have a traditional career as a novelist in the European sense, where you were producing a novel a year. And he was able to sustain that for a few years, but of course he didn't need to do that either, because he didn't need to live from his income in the way that Goncharov does. And it seemed to me that a lot of the frictions between writers have these kind of economic, social background, and that this, of course, this whole problem that you've so beautifully shown us was kind of another layer, many layers.
I think there are actually two problems here. The first one is about the nobility, because the problem is that if in 19th century Russia, if you are noble, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are rich and you can afford to get rid of official service, or at least you could afford to. Being noble didn't mean that you could just live on your own means. For example, let's take Dostoevsky. He was technically speaking noble. Even Belinsky was technically speaking noble, which was actually very funny even for himself. But they had to work as writers in just in European sense, if not more. They had to produce extraordinary amounts of texts always. And Goncharov, it was part of his individuality as a writer. He could not write fast enough. It's clear. And another problem, I think, which is probably more important, is that what is, I think, of crucial importance is that there really, you see, there was no middle class, bourgeois middle class in mid 19th century Russia. Goncharov was a merchant. Was actually son of a merchant, not merchant himself, so they were merchants, but they did not inform Russian literature and Russian culture of that time. Merchants were perceived as something very until the end of 19th century, merchants were perceived as a very peculiar and strange group with their traditional, very specific customs, not typical for Russian society as a whole. And basically, if we consider European censorship of the time, we can see that there was a point of agreement between censors and most representatives of society, and it was like the good taste of middle class. Yeah, it's, for example, censors used to not permit something that was immoral. Immoral for whom? Immoral for middle class. And middle class agreed with censors. Yeah, that's immoral. We should not allow that. We can see that I just it was just yesterday that I read a couple of books on that here in the library regarding censorship of drama in England in 19th century England. But in Russia, there was no that this point of agreement could not exist, because the censors could not just refer to a dominant group of in Russian society. I mean, what was that group? Could they? There was not like universal. By the mid 19th century, there was not universal cultural norms of nobilities. I believe there were. The authority of the nobility was decreasing very fast compared to the beginning of 19th century, compared to Pushkin's times, and that was the problem, because they could not find anything they could agree about. I mean, Russian society and censors. That's the problem.
Was there any agitation to have no censorship at all?
Yeah, sure. Sure, I quoted an article by Pisarev. It was written about French censorship, but it was very clear that it was in reality about Russian censorship. You see, censorship is bad. Everybody hates censors. You should not be censors. It's like that. And there was much more actually. It's another project which was discussed of reform, which was discussed in Russian newspapers, and actually the government provoked Russian newspapers and journals to discuss the incoming reform of censorship. It was, and they did discuss it, and actually, basically everybody stated that they didn't need preemptive censorship. The censorship should punish. That's basically said, of course, well, let's have censorship, but the censorship should punish the writer for what he had already published. The censorship should not prohibit anything before it's published.
Please, Anne and then Jane.
My question may be somewhat related to Hildy's, and that is the shame that was associated with being a censor at almost all times. Was there any kind of shame associated for working with working for other arms of the government, like Melnikov, for example, didn't he work for the Ministry of the Interior? Was that similarly stigmatized?
Well, that's an interesting question, but a very difficult one, because there is actually we have too much information, and it's very difficult to create a universal, like, generalizing picture. Sometimes it generally depends on who exactly was speaking and about whom exactly. For example, there is a modern Russian scholar, Abram Reitblatt, who likes the third section of his Majesty's Chancellor, the secret police, basically. Who likes it? He likes Russia's secret police so much, and he really found a lot of evidence that it was not shameful to be an agent of the third section in the 19th century. A lot. He really found a lot about that. But at the same time, well, if anybody, I think if anybody else tries to find something contrary to Reitblatt's argument, well, there would be a lot of information too, and a lot of evidence on that too. So it's really complicated, and it's really difficult to be sure. Of course, radicals like Pisarev and Chernyshevsky considered it shame, of course, but there were many people besides radicals. And and as for being a censor, well, it actually became shameful by 1860s, because before that it was also a matter of discussion. Somebody could consider it actually decent work for a writer, somebody considered it shame.
So my question is related to this about the image of bureaucracy or officialdom. And so when in the early when Goncharov accepts his position, and so on, this period, you have Nikitchenko saying this will save him from the officialdom.
Yeah.
So first question, what was the Russian word, and what part of officialdom did they mean? What was the Russian word for it? Translated.
As far as I remember, it's чиновничество.
Okay, so here we see already a kind of distinction between certain kind of state service, Turkish secretariat, and so on, and the higher position as censor. I wonder if you wanted to comment about that.
I see. I think the problem is that Goncharov was an ordinary official. He was an interpreter, and he had to translate texts on official matters. Actually, it's somewhat, well, his impression of how it worked is, I think it's somehow represented in his famous novel Common Story, where a young man arrives to St. Petersburg and he wants to create important projects of reforms, and instead he has to translate some hilarious articles on, like, agriculture, something like that. And that's one point. Goncharov and Nikitchenko and probably Goncharov believed that censor could become something more than that. Censor could become an independent agent who directs and establishes communications between the government and writers. That's their position. And they attempted to transform the censorship into that kind of agency. They really tried, and actually I will not discuss it in details, but I found a report that they submitted to the emperor, and it was literally written by Goncharov and Nikitchenko, and they really wanted it, and Veselsky, and they really wanted something to change in that regard. But as far as Goncharov was still a rank and file censor, and as far as the reform hasn't begun, it was not possible to become such a censor, and it was only possible to be a low-ranked official who mostly dealt with bureaucratic jobs, and it was an incredible amount of reading some boring books on on anything like on the history of Armenia or something like that. And Goncharov didn't want to read 1,000 pages on the history of Armenia. He wanted something else, but that's what he had to do. And he didn't want to produce like tons of official reports, but he had to produce them. And then after that, in 60s, Goncharov really did become a higher-ranked censor, and he could somehow influence the governmental politics. But by that time, the conflict between the government and the literature was so acute, it was so harsh, that it was not impossible. It was not possible to change something about that. It was, and Goncharov became more independent, and he became more important in censor. But he could only serve as an agent of repressive government and nothing else. So that's actually a very sad story. If we imagine how it looked from Goncharov's position, it's actually a very sad story.
I don't know how to phrase my question exactly. One talks of him as a censor, but was he censoring things in terms of his own discretion, his own judgment, or was he subject to precise prescriptions about what was allowed, what was not allowed, or was he chosen because the authorities felt they could rely on his own discretion and judgment?
I see.
Which way around was it?
Yeah, I see. That's actually that's the problem. The problem is that there was no unified. The position of the government was contradictory in itself. So part of the government, for example, Konstantin Nikolaevich, and people associated with him, wanted they did want new censors to be independent, and did want new censors to be professional writers who could judge the works based on their aesthetic merits too. But they were not influential enough to achieve the reforms that they wanted to achieve. So the censorship remained as it was. It remained mostly about following formal instructions and producing formal reports which had nothing to do with a writer's identity and writer's position. That's the problem, actually. So Goncharov wanted one thing, and liberal bureaucracy wanted one thing, but the result was completely different.
Well, I'm not quite clear though. Was it left? He was chosen because he could be relied on to use his own discretion and judgment.
Yeah.
Or did he have guidelines?
Yes, he did.
Lines that must not be
Yes,
crossed?
he had a lot of guidelines.
And also, to what extent was the censorship political or moral?
I see. I see. Yeah, there were a lot. Yeah, of course, there were guidelines, and there were a lot of them. But the problem is that when Goncharov was elected, they hoped that it would be possible to not only follow the guidelines, but also to judge the works while using his own capabilities as a writer. That's the contradiction. There were guidelines, but they thought he could somehow avoid at least some of those guidelines. In reality, he couldn't. That's the problem. And as for the censorship, well, it's very difficult to find clear difference between political and moral censorship, at least in a Russian context, because morally subversive ideas and works were also considered politically subversive. For example, criticism of the institution of family. It was considered both moral and political transgression at the same time, and also religious transgression too. So it's very, I know that usually the historians of censorship prefer to to divide censorship between moral, political, and religious. But at least in the Russian case, it's very difficult to do that.
I have kind of a follow-up question to this. Do you have a sense of what Goncharov was thinking when he tried to push through Piłsudski's 1,000 souls, because it was evidently, it should be evident to him that there's something possibly dangerous about about that he might get in trouble, right? And I wonder if you have any evidence on which to base a statement on this.
Well, generally speaking, and actually, well, it's hard to say for sure. It's hard to be sure.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I think that Goncharov just considered it this an outstanding novel, and he wanted it published because of that. So he wanted. It was actually a matter of exactly his identity as a writer. He wanted an outstanding novel to be published, and he achieved that. But but the problem is that he was punished for that. So for censor, it was not a good idea to do things like that. Well, but we can. We actually, we also know that Piłsudski remembered that very well, and I think it was like 15 years later that Piłsudski wrote a letter to Goncharov, and he said, "I remember that once you saved me and my novel." So yeah.
Just a quick factual question. When Goncharov was, as you say, punished for letting Censors go through, how was he punished? What happened to them when they?
Well, actually, I don't know how to translate this word. It's called wygovor.
Like a
reprimand.
Reprimand. Yeah, probably reprimand. Yeah, but it was actually not. It was it was official, and it could result in problems for his career. It didn't actually, but it could. And so on. So yeah, he was officially reprimanded for that, and well, it was. I think he had like 2 reprimands during all his career, and one of those was exactly for that these Chadush problems, and another one, as far as I remember, was about some minor problems, something like he counted the pages in the wrong way, something like that.
Questions? Thank you so much, Kirill.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very interesting discussion and productive too. I hope I will use something from what I heard today. My father wrote. Thank you.
Очень интересно.